Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am an educator at the museum. And this afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to David Lenga, a Holocaust survivor from Poland, who will share his story with you. Before we begin, I'd like to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure the world would always remember and learn from this tragic history. They did this at a time in the early 1960s when the Holocaust had only ended about 15 years earlier, and most survivors were not yet willing to relive their trauma, largely because the public was generally not yet ready to listen to it. But thanks to the courage and foresight of this group of survivors, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with a mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We can't do the work that we do today without our survivor community, who still on a regular basis shares their stories with groups to make sure that we all can remember and learn about this part of our history. It is my honor to welcome you and to introduce David Lenga, who has been active with our educational programs for many years. David, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your story with us. And you may begin.
Thank you so very much, Michael. It is my honor and privilege to appear before you, the audience. I am very pleased to be able to tell you my story because it is the story that is enduring, and it is a story that needs to be told. And I'm here to let you know, let me just get out of the screen so I can see better what is going on. Let's see. Can you take off that screen, Michael? That extra screen?
So if you're on the Zoom window, you click on share screen, which is in green.
Yes.
And then you should see your PowerPoint.
Okay. Yes.
And double click on your PowerPoint.
Okay, I'm right on.
Yes, we see it. Thank you.
Okay. So to introduce myself first, my name is David Lenga. I am a Holocaust survivor. I'm 94 years old. And I am here to share with you the story of my life. And that story is powerful because it teaches every single person that listens to me. It teaches them what history means, what it means to understand it in its real terms, and what it can lead to if people are indifferent to it. And so let me just say to you that before the war started, World War II, I was a very happy kid. I grew up in a wonderful environment. I grew up in Lodz, Poland. Lodz was the second largest city in Poland. We had a vibrant, large Jewish community. I grew up among people that loved me. My family was quite numerous on both sides of my father's and mother's side. My first language that I was ever speaking was Yiddish, because that's what everybody was speaking there. And by the time I was about 4 years old, I was bilingual because I had to learn Polish if I wanted to communicate with the world around me. And so at an early age, I discovered that being Jewish in Poland was something that you have to learn how to cope with. It was not an easy thing to do. It brought home mostly the tremendous anti-Semitism that existed in my hometown and all over Poland, actually. When I was very young, a kid, playing on the outside with non-Jewish children, because all our neighbors, most of them were non-Jewish. And we were getting along just fine. But at the minute I said or did something that mispleased them, immediately they spewed forth the anti-Semitic venom that was within them, and they called me a scabby Jew. I had no idea what that meant. I was too young to understand it, but I started crying, went running to my mom, and I asked her, "Mom, am I scabby?" "No," she says to me, "You are not. You're a wonderful boy, and I love you very much. And don't worry about those things. These children are just some plain mean what they're doing to you." So I learned very early on that being a Jewish person in a non-Jewish world, basically, is not an easy task, especially in Poland. And I grew up relying mostly on my own friends, my Jewish friends, my Jewish environment, my family. There were, as I was growing older, I discovered there were many Jewish institutions and clubs and youth movements that I used to join and be part of, and we really relied on each other and had a wonderful, wonderful life. That was before the war. By the time I was 11 years old, and my brother was 4 years younger than me, I had one brother by the name of Nathan. By the time I was 11 years old, the war broke out in Poland. It was an unexpected war. It was maybe a war that was anticipated because of what happened in the prior years to the war, to the outbreak of war. So the adults around me were very uneasy because they were listening and reading papers and understanding that Hitler came to power in Germany, and he had a nefarious plan to annihilate the Jewish people, and he made no secret of it. He wrote a book called Mein Kampf that was widely read, and in it, he's really enunciating all that he intends to do to get rid of the Jewish people of Europe. And everybody thought he was crazy. All the adults shrugging their shoulders. They did not believe it because Germany was a very educated, very progressive nation, the most progressive nation in Europe. They had the greatest writers, the greatest composers, the greatest scientists, the greatest educators, greatest schools and universities. How could a people like that even do anything like this? It was incomprehensible. And so people shrugged it off to a large degree and said that this is just a madman's talk. But folks, that was not a madman's talk. Just to show you the kind of life that the Jewish people were living and leading in Poland, here is a scene from the main street in Poland, in Lodz, Poland, where I was living. And you can see the vibrant life, the night cafes open, the people mingling, having a great time, and everybody was trying to get along with everybody else, obviously. This is the same scene here where after the war, the downtown Lodz, the city I was born in, looked like, and the life was good. People enjoyed it. That was before the war. Here you see a scene where the Jewish people were mingling among themselves, going to shul, going to prayers, going to school, to religious school. I was part of that scene. I was also going to religious school after public school. I was educated Jewishly. I loved being in this environment, in this in this society. And you see the boys in front of this picture. I could be any one of those boys because this is the life that the Jewish people of Lodz were leading. And we loved it. Here is the school that I was going to. It is repurposed now to become an apartment house after the war. But this is the school that housed thousands of people, of students, and this is where I was educated publicly. Here it shows another picture of Jewish people at prayer in the synagogue in Poland, and they were praying undisturbed in freedom and in peace. And you know, we took it all for granted that this is the life that people need to lead, and they did lead that life. So I was part of that, and I enjoyed it. My dad was a manufacturer. He had a tannery, employed a lot of people in the little town of Strykow, which is north of the city of Lodz, where I was born. And in that town, we used to go for vacations. It was a beautiful, beautiful place to vacation. And here is the place that I was to fish. I used to swim. I used to frolic around with my friends. I had great fond memories from that place. And then during that wonderful life that I was leading as a little boy of 11, a lot of things happened around me that I only had an inkling about, because I had no idea what the adults were talking about when they were very agitated and telling about what Hitler is doing in Germany to the German Jews, how he let loose his goons in 1938, I believe it was, or even before, that he let loose his Nazi goons on the Jewish population of Germany. And they were destroying everything in sight that was Jewish. Jewish stores, Jewish houses of worship, Jewish synagogues were burned, and that was done publicly for the whole world to see. And this news spread like wildfire throughout Europe. And of course, it reached Poland because we were bordering on Germany. We had a large border with Germany. And so we were afraid that he's going to expand his ambitions and invade Poland. So the atmosphere of fear and foreboding, you could cut with a knife, literally. It was that ominous. And I was privy to all this. I was witnessing it happening. Among all the joy and beauty of life that we enjoyed, we had to cope with these news coming from Germany. And of course, then that is another scene of what the Germans did to Jewish people and their stores and their businesses at the Kristallnacht that was happening in Germany. I believe it was in 1938 or something. And this is the Friedrichstraße in Berlin. And the Germans just passed by, and some of them were just laughing it off and didn't think anything bad about it. But the Jewish people were the ones that all this anger and horror was directed at. And we really suffered greatly, especially the German Jews that tried to flee Germany to save their lives. And that was before the outbreak of World War II. That was 1930s, maybe 37, 38. And here you see synagogues burning and people watching in the vicinity, watching it go up in flames. And that was in 1938, November the 16th. Burning the synagogues openly for the whole world to see. And this is what was happening before the outbreak of World War II. But in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. But look at this. They rounded up all the Jewish people on Kristallnacht, and they put them into Buchenwald concentration camp. Here are German Jews being rounded up, staying on roll call, and being persecuted and destroyed, their lives destroyed, their possessions taken away. This is in the camp of Buchenwald. That happened in 1938. There is a forever to be remembered admonition. It says that Kristallnacht was an essential turning point in Nazi Germany's persecution of Jews, and it culminating in the Holocaust. It was the result of hatred left unchecked and unchallenged. And that, my friends, holds true then, and it holds true today. If hatred is left unchecked and unchallenged, it will raise its ugly head and spread like a wildfire and affect everybody, everybody, no exception. And then, of course, the Jews tried to flee Germany, and the people around Germany, in France and in Poland, were in panic, and they did not know what to do. So whoever could afford was fleeing for their lives, to save their lives. Here you have the St. Louis ship, full of Jewish refugees, escaping the Nazi regime and trying to find safe haven in the West, in the United States, in Cuba, in other parts of the West. And they were refused entry. In Canada, they were refused entry. They were refused entry everywhere. They were trying to find safe haven to save their lives. And this was before World War II broke out. And here you have the same people on that ship, children happy that they reached the shores of freedom that they thought was freedom. They saw the Statue of Liberty already. They wanted to debark and go on shore, but they were turned back and they could not do it. Here, they're trying desperately to reach the shore, and little boats debarking the big boat, and they were turned back and not let in. And as a consequence, the ship had to turn back to Germany, and most of the people were killed by Germany, by the Nazis. And then in 1939, I was 11 years old. I was in a streetcar that was attacked suddenly from the air with attack planes, German attack planes. It was what Germany called ein Blitzkrieg, a lightning war. And all of a sudden, in September the 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland viciously. And I was right there in the middle when it happened, because I was in a streetcar and the area was attacked from the air. And I watched at 11 years of age in horror how hundreds, literally, of people were machine gunned to death, body parts flying, and people were running for cover, and so did I. And that was the beginning of World War II. And here is a picture of Germany occupying Poland in 1939. It was the most frightening sight. And it was most terrifying for the Jewish people, because we knew what is coming. We knew what their intentions were, but we were trapped and we could not get out. And that is another picture showing you the Nazi motorized troops invading Poland in great masses, and in the background, devastated, bombed out buildings. That was war, World War II, and I was part of that war. And here, after Poland was caved and lost the war in 3 weeks, here Hitler is standing in a victory parade in Warsaw in 1939, reviewing his troops that conquered Poland. It was something that I will never forget, because I was part of that horror. Here you have again another picture of German troops occupying Poland in great numbers, very heavily armed against the population. And what followed after this infamous day was something that becomes hard to describe, especially what befell the Jewish people. At 11 years of age, I found myself thrown into a ghetto in Strykow together with my family. It was the town that we had a tannery, and we had to slave labor for the Germans in that very factory. They established a ghetto in that little town, and the people were told not to dare to move outside the perimeter of that assigned ghetto in the city of Strykow. It was a small town with a large Jewish population. And we had to work there for 2 years, slave there, and create clothing, fur, leather, and other goods for the German army. And that was by edict. That was an order. My father was deprived of the factory. This was taken away from him, confiscated by the German Reich. And before the war, I had a wonderful family, as I said. Here is a picture of my paternal side of my family. It was taken in 1907, when my father was only 6 years old. And here is my dad next to his mother sitting down, 6 years of age. All of his siblings are right here. There was one sibling that lived in England, and the picture of him is on the table. My grandpa, my grandma, and my oldest aunt. She was the only girl among all boys. 7 brothers, 1 sister. And all of them, save for my dad, perished in this war. All of them. Out of 100 people in my family, only 2 people survived when the war was over. Here is a memory picture of my maternal family unveiling a grave site of my grandmother's brother. And this is a memory for me that I look at and I realize that none, save for my father right here, none of these people survived the war. Everybody was murdered in cold blood, including my brother, my mom, and everyone I ever loved. That was horrendous. And so I witnessed, as soon as the Germans came in, I witnessed how they were rounding up the Jewish people, that anyone that with a beard, and many Jews, of course, religious Jews, had beards, and they, soldiers, were shaving off their beards, and actually many of them were tearing the hair of the beard from their faces, and they left them bloody, and they left them wounded, and they left them humiliated, and that was the purpose. And so, okay, let me see where I'm at. Okay, so here's the picture. So when I was still in Lodz, before I was taken away, my grandfather was with us. My father's father, my paternal grandfather, he was in his 60s. He had a long white beard. He was an official in the synagogue. He was a very religious man. And they tore literally the beard off his face, and he came home bloody and wounded and unbelievably hurt. And I saw this, and I was totally helpless. And we were just feeling with him. This is what the Germans did as soon as they occupied the city of Lodz. I witnessed all that. I also witnessed the intimidation. They were trying to put fear in the people. Here is a hanging, a public hanging of innocent men and women, public hanging, that they rounded up Jewish men and put placards on their chest saying that they are criminals, that they are thieves, or whatever they could think of to justify this killing and this hanging. And what they did, and they did it in a public place so that the rest of the population can be so cowed and intimidated that there will be no resistance to their rule. This is part of the horror that I saw with my own eyes. And then, after 2 years of hard labor, in Strykow, the Jews were rounded up and they were thrown into the larger ghetto of Lodz, where that ghetto in 1942 was totally established. And here is the ghetto in Lodz that is already functioning and established. And here are the poor Jews milling around in this despair, hungry, starved. That this bridge is a connecting bridge between two sides of the street, because in the middle was a streetcar going through. That is the bridge in the ghetto of Lodz. And here you have another picture showing the Jews evacuated from their own homes that they used to live all around the city, and they had to vacate and be thrown out from their apartments, and they had to take whatever they could on their back, whatever possessions they could carry with them, and they were all herded into the ghetto of Lodz. This is a Jewish policeman. He is a creation of the Nazis. They created the Jewish police force to keep order in the ghetto so that there will be no uprising or no disturbance to their rule. And here you have another picture of the ghetto of Lodz, the dreary life, the horror, the despair, the milling around aimlessly, going to work with hard labor when they were told to. And here's a horse-drawn carriage with dead corpses covered up to be taken to be burned in mass graves outside the city of Lodz. Here you have another picture showing the Jewish police. They are being totally under the control of the Nazis because the Nazis created them. And they had to do their bidding, the Nazi bidding, to keep order in the ghetto. Here, Jews are being herded into the ghetto, and the sign right here, it says, Wohngebiet der Juden betreten verboten. That means this is the residence area of the Jews, and any trespass is totally forbidden. And so they are being herded in to the confines of the ghetto that has already been created. I was all part of this. I was all part of this. I could have been any one of those young boys walking here. And I remembered it so vividly. This is what the Germans, what the Nazi Germans did to the Jewish people. They devastated them, they incarcerated them, they killed them and murdered them in full blood for the whole world to see. And no one raised a finger in protest. There were no sit-ins, there were no walk-ins, there were no placards on the streets, there were no students marching, there was nobody marching in protest. the newspapers hardly mentioned anything that was happening. They knew it very well. If they put a little column on some news item, it was buried inside the paper that few people read. And so the world stood silent, deliberately silent, and enabled Hitler and his henchmen to do their work and to annihilate the Jewish people of Europe. And I witnessed all that. I was part of this horror. Here we have a picture of this substation in the city of Lodz, in the suburb of Lodz. The Germans named this substation Radegast when they occupied it, but actually in Polish, it is called Radogosz. So that exists now as a museum, and people are now, of course, after the war, coming to see what happened. These are tourists, people coming to see what happened during the war. And what happened was that when the Lodz Ghetto was eventually in 1944 evacuated by the Germans, because the Allies came very close. And so all these people, the Jewish people that were still of able-bodied men and women, they were taken to this substation, and put on cattle cars and transported to Auschwitz and to other labor camps, or to be killed in Treblinka and other places. This is the cattle car. This is the cattle car that looked like what it looked like when the Jews were herded in. No windows, no air, nothing. It is totally hermetically closed and being guarded heavily by guards when they were transporting the Jews to their deaths. This is what it looked like. I was in that car going to Auschwitz from when I was transported from the Lodz Ghetto in 1944. Here in the ghetto also, I witnessed horrendous scenes. I witnessed a dying Jewish child laying on the street. Notice people are walking by. Nobody was able to bend down to that child and see if it's still breathing, if it could be helped in any way or consoled in any way, because people lost their capacity for compassion. They lost the capacity for humanity. Their souls were mortified, petrified. All they could think of is how to survive the next hour, the next day, because everyone was deliberately starved to death. That was the scenes that I was witnessing as a young boy in the ghetto in Lodz. Here are other children, also starving, aimless, mortified, probably orphaned, and just milling around aimlessly in the Warsaw Ghetto. Here we have a picture of children in the ghetto in 1942, in the Warsaw Ghetto, where people are again around aimlessly walking, hungry, looking for a piece of bread or anything to nourish them, and the children equally starved and not knowing what to do with themselves. So they're gathering together small groups for comforting each other. Here there is a scene from the Warsaw Ghetto where Jews were herded into those cattle cars and evacuated to Treblinka extermination camp. All of them were murdered in cold blood, all of them. Here is the infamous Auschwitz entrance, where it says, Arbeit macht frei, work will make you free. This was the most horrendous place on earth when I was taken from the ghetto in Lodz to be thrown in as a prisoner into Auschwitz, Birkenau. And in Auschwitz, I found hell on earth. It is beyond description. It was a tightly, hermetically closed prison with barbed wire, electrified wire. You touch it, you die. People were starved to death and burned to death in that place, And I found myself there. And by some miracle, after trying to escape, which was impossible, I found a surreptitious way of how to sneak my way out from that place after several days of anguish. And I found myself going to Germany into labor camps later on. So here is what I found when I got into Auschwitz. I found this scene where I will be sleeping in those barracks and those assigned little cubicles where all the other men were sleeping and trying to get some rest after a horrendous day's work. They were starved. They were not surviving, many of them, the next day. And when I was herded into this place, and I was only about 16 years old at that time, it was in 1944, I went to sleep, exhausted totally from very hard work during the day. And I said goodnight to the person to the right and to the person to the left. When I woke up in the early morning, both of them were dead, and I was the only one still alive. This is a scene that kept repeating itself on a daily basis. It is so impossible to believe that humans can do this to other humans. But that is what the Jews of Europe had to endure. And these are the memories that we have. Here is a picture of the infamous angel of death, Dr. Mengele, Joseph Mengele, right here in the middle. Trying to contemplate how many more victims they can dispose of in a day. Here you have Jewish children showing tattooed numbers on their arms in Auschwitz. It was the most horrendous sight. These children, most of them perished by fire, by concentration camp ovens. They were eliminated as human beings altogether and erased from the world. They were taken away from their fathers and mothers that loved them and that they loved. And there was just ashes left after the Nazis were through. This is Dr. Mengele's experiments, children. Look at the starved, emaciated bodies. He was experimenting medical experiments on these poor children, and there were so many of them. And this is something that is a memory and something that is a mental picture that cannot be erased from memory, because it should never be erased. It should always be remembered what the Nazis did, the nefarious work that they did to exterminate and totally eradicate the Jewish people of Europe. And after Auschwitz, after I was fortunate enough to escape surreptitiously, as I said, and I found myself thrown in after a long ride to Germany proper, and I wound up in Bavaria, and I found myself being thrown into the concentration camp of Dachau. This concentration camp was horrendous. It was the main camp in the Bavarian area that had a lot of sub-camps also built for the concentration camp victims and laborers. And there we were processed, we were deloused, we were given ill-fitting shoes that belonged to somebody else that they killed. We were given uniforms, striped uniforms, and completely shaved our heads. And we were processed to become slave laborers in that area for the Germans. It was a horrendous place. In that place, I had to register like everyone else. And this is the registration form that I had to fill out in Dachau when I came, and I had to state in my own handwriting, I had to state the place of birth, the date of birth, where I came from, how old I am, and so forth and so on, all the particulars. And I had to sign it under the threat of death. In other words, if anything that they found inconsistent with the truth in this form that I signed, they will kill me. And they made no bones about it. I had to sign that. But what I also did, knowing already what I already knew and being through what I already went through by the time I got there, I was so street smart and savvy, I decided to make myself older than I actually was in order to survive the war. Because when you're older, you're considered more able-bodied. And so I made myself older, and I put my date of birth here as 1925 rather than 1927 by actual birth. And so this is what happened during that time. It saved my life, maybe, I'm not sure. So when the war already came to an end, and the American forces, soldiers came to Dachau, this is the front of the concentration camp that they saw. The big swastika with the eagle, and they went in. They did not have an idea what they're going to find. What they did find is this. They found horrendous Nazi atrocities with naked bodies strewn about in a container, it seems like, in a pit. And there were so many hundreds and maybe thousands of those corpses that these soldiers were witnessing and encountering in Dachau. What happened was that in Dachau, many people, many Jewish people that came there, they were killed by starvation, by death marches, and by slave labor that was inhuman in severity and in long hours of hard work. I was part of that. Here we have the Dachau concentration camp that is occupied by American forces already. United States soldiers taking control over the camp. And here we have a picture of the infamous SS chief Heinrich Himmler and his henchmen inspecting the Dachau concentration camp, making sure that all the ovens are working well and the Jews are being killed according to plan. Here we have Jews being led to their death at the Dachau concentration camp. These are new arrivals, men, women, and children. They all were herded there and brought there to die in ovens. And here we have a picture of forced labor being marched to slave labor work on a daily basis. Here are Jews being herded together for a death march. And so many of them were not able to do this march, and they died on the way. So many. After Dachau, being there a few days, I was selected, along with other prisoners, to be thrown in, as it were, to the subcamp of Kaufering, which is a subcamp of Dachau in Bavaria. And that is the entrance to the Kaufering slave labor camp. It was the most dreary, the most horrendous place on earth. It turned out to become an epidemics camp. People got very sick. I was very sick. I almost died there. And I had to endure being in that camp for an entire year till the spring of 1945. And at about that time, in spring of 1945, the Allied forces, the Russian forces, and all the Allies together were trying to occupy Germany. They were already on German soil. That was already after the Battle of Normandy. That was already after the big fights and battles in Stalingrad, Leningrad. The hordes, the Russian hordes, came from everywhere in Russia by the thousands, and they stormed towards Germany. And Germany realized that the war is lost to them at that point in 1945. So they eliminated all these southern camps, and they tried to bring the people that are still able-bodied to be evacuated to the north, to Bergen-Belsen, and away from the south, where the invasion was happening. And here we have another picture of a dead and tortured Jewish prisoner in Kaufering is carried to a mass grave by other prisoners. This was repeating itself on a daily basis many, many times, and I was witness to all of this horror as a young boy, all of this horror. When Germany finally capitulated, then this is the German unconditional surrender of the United States force. They capitulated, they signed an unconditional surrender. And here is the German general that did the signing. He was German General Alfred Jodl. He signed the German unconditional capitulation in 1945. Look at the jubilation that happened when the liberated prisoners found out that the Germans lost and the war is over and they were liberated by American forces. The jubilation is beyond description. Unfortunately, so many could not make it, and so many died and perished in a terrible way. Here is another picture of a prisoner along with a POW. You could still see a semblance of a uniform celebrating liberation from concentration camp Dachau. Here are prisoners going out of their mind, trying to savor the moment of liberation and hoisting the American flag in gratitude for being liberated. And here is another picture where there used to be the roll call place. And here is the incredible scenes of that. So here are Jewish children liberated by the Soviet Army in 1945. It's incredible that they even survived, but the scars that they were experiencing and that they had to bear for the rest of their life is beyond description. And very many were so scarred, both mentally, mostly mentally, and many physically as well. They did not turn out to be normal human beings, many of them. After the war ended, I was 17 years old. And this is a picture of the survivors, the few survivors that survived. And I'm among them. That was in the survivors, in the Feldafing displaced persons camp in Bavaria. I am right here at the very bottom on the left, sitting down. And all these young people that did survive, they are smiling here. But let me tell you something. There is really not a lot to smile about because so many have become crippled for life. Like this man next to me, He was castrated. He's never going to be able to have a normal life again. Many of the women were experimented on medically, and they were also totally deprived of ever having children again. So they had scars that they have experienced, and yet they managed, in 1945, when the war was over, they managed to resemble a normal human being with smiles on their faces. Here is a picture of the man that saved my life in concentration camp, a French Jew. I don't recall his name, but I'm grateful for him to save my life. And the reason he did, he was the foreman in the barracks. He brought me some soup. I don't know where he got it from, but he got some soup for me to kind of keep me alive after a very great illness in that barrack. And I survived the war. And here I am on the very left, standing up. When the war ended, I went from Germany to Sweden. And this is a picture of me just as soon as I came to Sweden in 1945 after the war ended. I came to Sweden to search for relatives, to search for somebody that survived the war that I could call my own, that I could identify with. And I found nobody. I found nobody. However, oh, sorry, didn't mean it that way. Something disappeared here from me. Okay, here we are. Okay, so here I am on a train together with all the other survivors. I'm in the background right here standing up. And all these survivors were taking on life's challenges again and trying to become normal human beings. They made contact with each other. Relationships were forming. People got married, and they wanted to establish a life. They wanted to not dwell on the past. It is hard as it was. I was trying to assume the same attitude because I knew that my future is what counts, not my past. And so consequently, I married the girl of my dreams in 1945 in Malmö, Sweden. She was Charlotte Katz. She was a Holocaust survivor from Czechoslovakia. And we decided to get married and form a family and recreate our lives again, the life that was so destroyed for both of us because she lost so many of her own family. And this was in Malmö, Sweden, in the southern town of Sweden, that we got married. And this is the synagogue, actually, better picture, that we were married in. And that synagogue stands today there also. Here are my friends that survived the war with me, my two friends. And here I am at the time when I was still courting my wife. And she was just liberated, just like I was. And we found ourselves in Sweden together. It was a beautiful memory. I knew after a while that my dad survived the war, but we could not get together. He was in Poland, I was in Sweden. It was a long haul. It was impossible to get together. We were destitute, we had nothing. We just came out from concentration camp. But the many years of trying, after about 8 years or more, after the war, finally I got together with my dad, and he was living in Israel at that time. He came to visit me. And at that point, I was not only married, I have two beautiful children, my oldest daughter, Helene, and my younger daughter, Bert. And of course, later on in America, we had the third child, Barbara. And here's my dad, Abraham. I didn't see him since 1942. And during that interim, a lot of things happened. A lot of things happened. And we were so overjoyed to join finally together in person. Many years later, I was visiting my dad many times after the war. And here it was 1987 in Israel, when I came to visit my dad, he was old already, and he already needed a walker, but I was with him, and I was enjoying his company, and we were having so much to catch up with all the time, talking about the past, what happened to our families. Here's my dad, 1945, what he looked like. He was only 44 years old. Only 44 years old. He lost everything, everybody, except I was the only son that was left alive. And here's my grandfather, my father's father, Lenga, at 60. He was murdered in the ghetto in Lodz, and this is the beard that they were tearing off his face during the war. I witnessed all that. This was part of my experience. After being together with my wife, happily, very happily, being married for 50 years, I decided to remarry her all over again, retake the vows, and make the kind of wedding that I promised that I will one day, when this happens, a wedding that we will not forget. And here we are, taking the vows under the chuppah after 50 years of marriage. And that woman in my life, that Charlotte, she was everything for me to the very last breath. And I loved it to no end. And I miss it terribly. And she left a tremendous legacy for me with 3 beautiful daughters. And for this, I'll be always grateful. Here is the picture of my entire family that I rebuilt after the war ended. It took me a long time, but I did rebuild my family. And here are my grandchildren. And my little one, Amy, at that time, she was 4 years old. Today, she is a grown woman, of course, like all of them are adults now. And this is my youngest daughter, Barbara, my oldest daughter, Helene, and my middle daughter, Bert, and their children, and I and Charlotte, savoring the moment of being together and seeing this come to fruition, that I promised, that I said that I will do, and I really went through it. And so here is another picture of myself, my wife, after we married our oldest daughter, Helene. This was after the war. I refused to have my past, my dark past, dictate my future. I just refused to do it. So I took my future on and I rebuilt it and I lived it and I made a thriving family. Here is my late wife, Charlotte, with her 3 wonderful, beautiful daughters. Something that is a memory that will always stay with us. After she left us, after 55 years of marriage, she left us, unfortunately, tragically, in an accident. I became alone, and here I am with my 3 daughters, celebrating an occasion. Here is me marching on the March of the Living in Jerusalem in 2017, for the first time in 71 years that I went back to Poland to march in memory of the 6 million Jews that were annihilated during the war. I was so proud that I was able to do it and be persuaded by my youngest daughter, because I took her along with her husband and children. And we were all there in very proudly marching in the memory of the Holocaust, the memory of the millions of people that did not survive the war. And then later on, I was summoned to come to Auschwitz with my middle daughter, Bert. And here I am in front again of that infamous Arbeit macht frei gate in Auschwitz. That was, of course, 75 years later. And I was able to show my daughter all the places that I was and all the things that I went through and all my dark past during the war. And she was privy to all that. And as a second generation, she will carry on the legacy of the memory forever. Here, I'm talking to the press. Actually, it is Mr. David Marks, another Holocaust survivor, that is talking to the press, being interviewed of what happened in Auschwitz. Here is the World Jewish Congress President, Dr. Ronald Lauder. He made it possible for the 200 survivors to come to Auschwitz in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Here I am talking directly to the press and telling them part of my experiences there. After the press, after the celebration, we came to the very highlight of that day, and we were at a humongous tent erected by the Polish government. This is the inside of it, and this is the tent that was erected right in front of Auschwitz concentration camp. This is the entrance to the gate of hell, where millions of innocent men, women, and children were annihilated, killed, and burned just because they were Jews. That was the only crimes they committed. And you can see hundreds, maybe thousands of people gathered in that tent. There were people from dignitaries, people from the church representatives. There were people, presidents and ministers from every European country, and as well as the United States. There was the section here of the Holocaust survivors, 200 of them, witnessing the proceedings. And on the stage, of course, huge stage with a screen, was the speech of the evening given by Ambassador Lauder, and it was a very moving, heartbreaking, unbelievable speech that spoke to the heart of the Holocaust, of what happened. We witnessed this, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to be there. And after 20 long years of silence, that I did not open up and tell my story because I couldn't. I was completely knotted up inside. I just couldn't bring myself. By the way, even if I wanted to, during those 20 years, people were not ready to listen. They were not. But after 20 years, the survivor community decided it's enough. We need to speak up to what happened during the Holocaust. How important it is for the people to know those things, because if you don't know, then you are liable to repeat the same mistake again and again. People need to be educated. They need to understand that the Holocaust did not fall down from heaven spontaneously. The Holocaust was planned meticulously, carried out meticulously, deliberately. It was an attempt to eradicate, literally eradicate, the Jewish people from all of Europe. It is unprecedented in the annals of history, and it is something that must never, ever be forgotten. That is why I am doing what I'm doing. I'm speaking to you. I'm speaking to other large audiences, to students in schools, to teachers, to every place I could think of that will listen, and to make them understand that what they see, what they hear, what I experience is something that actually did happen, because those Holocaust deniers are trying to deny this. This cannot be denied. I'm alive. I'm the eyewitness. I'm the one that was there along with so many thousands of others. My entire family was wiped out in the Holocaust. I was the only one, and my father, that survived the war out of 100 people in my family. People need to understand the ramifications of not caring. You cannot become apathetic when you see horror arising on the horizon, when you see evil raising its ugly head. You cannot be apathetic about that. You have to speak up. And so after 20 long years, I decided to write a book about my experiences, and I call it The Compassion of a Deadly Enemy. It is very specific, very explicit, and very detailed. Much more so than I could tell you in 1 hour. But it is finally a place where I could really describe the cruelty, the inhumanity, and the devastation that the Nazis caused to the world. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that my speech has sounded a resonance with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. If anybody has any questions, you can use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can use the comments section, and we'll answer as many questions as possible. And David, I'm going to take your screen down just so that we'll be able to see your screen bigger during the Q&A.
Okay.
We do have a couple of questions. First question is, how did your father survive?
My father survived by sheer miracle, as far as I'm concerned, because when he was taken away in 1942 from the city of Strykow, where we slave labored in our factory for 2 years, he was a very, very sick man, very sick indeed. He was so sick, in fact, that the religious Jews in that town got together in a minyan and in a quorum, and they added a name of Chaim, which means life, to his name in order to intercede with God to spare his life. So when they were taking him away, my mother turned to me at that time and she said, David, I need you to understand that your father is so sick, he will not be able to make it through the night. And for the entire time of the war, I thought he was dead. I never believed that he survived. But somehow, his resilience, his resolve, his strength, his moral strength made him survive. And he did. And he is the only one, and he and me, that survived the war out of 100 people of the immediate family. It's a miracle.
Thank you so much. So to clarify, you were in the ghetto in Strykow and then in Lodz.
Yes,
and from Lodz you were sent.
We were taken away from our residence in Lodz in 1945 to the city of Strykow, where we had a factory. And in that city, a ghetto was established by the Nazis, and we had to work in my father's factory, which was confiscated by the German army. And we had to produce leather and goods and clothing for the German army and for the government for 2 years. It was really slave labor because we were starved during that time, and we had very long hours of work, and many people just could not make it because there was no medicine or hospital or any kind of attention that we could get when we got sick or feeling ill. If you get sick, you die, and that's it. That is what we experienced in Strykow. And after that, we were thrown into the ghetto lodge.
In the ghettos or camps, did you ever experience any spiritual resistance, such as anybody engaging in secret religious practices or anything like that?
In concentration camps, this was an absolute no-no. It was a taboo because if you were caught acting out in any religious way or practicing any religious rites, you were summarily shot. So there were some very religious Jews that were doing it in secret. Nevertheless, they risked their lives to do it. And so they were trying to get together a quorum, and they were praying, on Friday night, for Shabbat prayers. They were trying to remember holidays, that we didn't have all the things that we needed to really celebrate or anything, but we were at least resorting to prayer, and those that were still believing in God at that time, they were really praying their heart out for God to help us. But God did not listen. He averted his sight from us, and he let the Holocaust proceed.
Thank you. How long were you in Auschwitz for?
How long? I was in Auschwitz actually less than a week. And the reason that I was able to do this is, like I mentioned in my speech, I was finding a surreptitious way how to escape Auschwitz by infiltrating an area that was already selected, an area of 200 men that was selected as laborers in construction to go to Germany to work as laborers in Germany proper, away from Auschwitz. And I knew that the only way I could escape Auschwitz is to infiltrate that selected area. And I found a way to do it by joining two men that were carrying a big bucket of soup from the kitchen to that area. And I joined them, and I put my shoulder underneath that heavy pole that carried the soup. And I said, we're going to, all three of us, go into this area with the soup. And the guys were furious with me. They said, you cannot do this because we're only two of us. And now they know that you're going to bring us trouble. And so finally I intimidated them. They let me go. I came in, they put the soup down, and I disappeared in the crowd among the 200 selected men. But I didn't belong there because I was not selected, but I infiltrated. And that was enabling me to go to Germany proper and slave labor camps and away from Auschwitz.
Thank you very much. And when you were finally liberated, do you remember the first thoughts that went through your mind?
Thinking back, my first thoughts were almost comical if you think of it today, because I thought that the world will find out what happened finally, and they will all embrace us, and they will all feel sorry for us, and they were all trying to make good for what we did, for what we suffered, and that the people will take us in with open arms and welcome us and have compassion and you know, show us kindness. Not that this happened. Nothing of this happened. None of this happened. That was the biggest disillusionment in my life. But I quickly learned that people, in order to survive, they have to ultimately fend for themselves. Do not count on the goodness of others. If it happens, you are lucky, but do not count on it. You need to help yourself to survive and to do everything you can to leave the past behind you, because that past becomes a tremendous burden, and to try to move on and to look forward and to have a vision of what kind of future you want to have for yourself.
When did you come to the United States, and what did you do here for work?
Well, I became a very good tailor in the ghetto in Lodz, because my uncle, my father's oldest brother, he was in charge of the only biggest factory of clothing factory in the city of Lodz. I was taken in there under his wings. He was in charge of it. He taught me every facet of tailoring during those 2 years that I was there. And by the time the ghetto was dissolved, and I was like 16 years old, I was a full-fledged tailor. I could produce an entire garment on my own. I've learned a trade, a profession, and that was saving my life during the war, and that came in great stead for me after the war, because I could support myself and my family.
Thank you. Can you share a little bit about readjusting to the relationship with your father, as you had assumed that he did not survive for so many years, and then you found him later and weren't able to visit him even so for another few years? What was it like to have him in your life again?
Well, it is not really that hard to describe, because first of all, once I discovered that my father survived the war, of course, I was elated to no end. And I was just so anxious to find a way how we could get together in person and just embrace each other and try to tell each other what happened during our separation. I wasn't able to do it because I didn't have the means, the material means, the money to send them tickets to come from Poland or from Israel to Sweden, where I was. And he didn't have any either. He was just newly liberated himself. So we were both in dire straits in that sense. And so we communicated by letters. Our letters were Yiddish. So we wrote letters in Yiddish to each other, because this was the language that we grew up with. And we communicated, and we tracked each other's whereabouts, and we told each other about our lives. And this was the way we had contact. Telephones were very expensive at that time. We didn't have any to begin with, but even public telephones were expensive. So we just had to resort to communication by postal service. And for a long time, this is the only way we could communicate. And then one day, after many years, after maybe 8 years of separation, he was already in Israel at that time. He had to flee Poland because anti-Semitism was terrible. They chased him out from there. They told him they're going to kill him. You goddamn Jew, you get out of Poland. They told him, we don't want you here. And so he had to flee back, and he wound up in Germany. In Germany first, but then later on he wound up in Israel. And so I was in Sweden and he was in Israel. And I was working very, very, very hard as a tailor. And I was working on 3 jobs and saving all the money that I knew how to do with my wife. And we finally got together a ticket for a ship to take him from Israel to visit us in Sweden and back to Israel, a round trip ticket. And that was expensive, but we finally managed to do it. We sent it to him, to Israel, and he came to visit us in 1953. When we left each other, that was in 1942. So that was like 11 years that we haven't seen each other at that point. But when he finally came, it was an incredible reunion. We had so much to talk about, so much to catch up. He told me about the horrors that he went through, and I told him what I went through. And we realized how much we've lost, how much he has lost his family, and how much I've lost my family. It was a heartbreaking tale, if you will. But then we kept up our contacts throughout his life. And I visited him in Israel from America 40 times, 40. 40 times I came to Israel to visit my dad as he was aging, till the very last day. And he died in 1990, near 90 years old, almost 90 years old. Yeah.
He was able to get to know his grandchildren.
Yeah, oh yeah. I sent my children to Israel absolutely for vacations and for whole summer, just to be with their grandparents and get to know them. Sure, he was so proud of them. He was so proud of his grandchildren. Yeah, he was showing off with them.
I just want to ask, because I know you so well, that you have such a great sense of humor. Is this something your father shared with you? Did your father also like to tell jokes?
Oh my God, he was such a humorist. I learned so much from him. I mean, he was just incredible. You know, he told me everything that I knew about humor. Um, you know, he had a tremendous, wonderful voice as well. He loved to sing. So did my mom. I inherited some of that. Yeah, he had a great sense of humor, and we were laughing together. We were telling each other stories and jokes and funny stuff. Yeah, we had a wonderful time when we were together after the war. He rebuilt his life as well. He remarried to a woman that was also a Holocaust survivor. She had a husband with 5 children before the war. They all perished. And so they made a life together in Israel. And they lived together for 45 years, actually, until he died. And so he became a builder, my dad. He built homes and barns and all kinds of farmhouses. And he became very successful in what he was undertaking. And yeah, he had a very good life in Israel, actually, in the end. He loved it. He just loved it. And I loved it, love to see it. And so whenever we got together, we had a wonderful time. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing about that. We have a question here, and then it's a little personal, and if you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's totally understandable. Did this experience affect your faith?
You know, this is a very, very sensitive question. And I've been asked this several times, actually, by even students and other people. It is very difficult to answer this question with one word. You cannot. The fact is that during the peak of the Holocaust, during the most darkest time in my life, when I have seen all this horror and misery, I lost faith in God. And I was raised religiously. I was a very religious boy. I was going to shul with my father and grandfather every Shabbat, every Friday night, every Shabbat, every holiday. I observed every tenet of Judaism. I was very religious. And I believe strongly in an almighty God, in a merciful God, in a God of forgiveness. But when I saw and experienced what happened during the war, I lost faith. How could I not? I lost faith because I was questioning, where is God? He watches all this happening. Where is God not intervening? After all, we are his chosen people. What are we chosen for? Chosen for murder, for misery? I could not get myself to hold on to my faith. And it slipped away from me for a long time. For a long time. After the war, I had many questions regarding my faith and God, my relationship with God. I had a lot of questions, but I had no answers. Then one day, I encountered the Chabad rabbi, a young man, and we were discussing that very same issue. I wanted to have some answers. So this is what he said to me. And that is the only answer I ever got from anyone that was plausible enough for me to accept and to renew my faith. And that's what he said. He said, when God decided to expel Adam and Eve from paradise for a transgression that they made against God, he punished them in many ways. One of the punishments that he leveled on them was they have now to assume personal responsibility for their own actions. God does not want any longer to be responsible for human actions. That's why he gave them a free will. Knowing this, the humans needed to know that their actions will determine their life and their fate. And so if you're a good person and good to others and merciful, it'll stand in your good stead. If you're mean and you decided to be evil, you will have to take consequences. So this is what he said. And he said, God did not come down from the heavens and personally carry a machine gun to kill people. God did not do that. It is the people that killed other people. It's the evil people that destroyed the innocent good people. For this, they will have their consequences in the hereafter. But God cannot be blamed for what happened when evil people are choosing to kill innocent others. God cannot be held responsible for that because the free will was given to the human. And that reasoning did something to me. It made me think. And I finally came to the conclusion that, yes, it was evil people doing it to innocent people. It wasn't God. And so I renewed my faith in God. And I am hoping that what I now believe in the Almighty is going to ease my tortured questions that I had till now.
Thank you so much for that answer. We have several audience members commenting, just saying thank you so much, and specifically praising your strength and your determination to go on afterwards. So we thank you so much. And your cousin Alan Berman in England also says hi. He tuned in. And to conclude, David, you speak on such a regular basis, particularly to students or future generations. What would you like your audience to take away from learning your story today?
What is most important for my audiences to take away from what I'm telling them is that apathy and indifference in the face of evil leads to disaster, leads to tragedy, leads to different kind of holocausts, because evil men will always emerge on the horizon. They will always grab for power. They will always try to dominate the masses. And it is the people that are being ruled, that cannot afford to be oppressed, cannot afford their freedom to be taken away. Always think that freedom is not free. It's never free. You have to fight for it. You have to battle it out. You have to stand up and be counted. And when you see evil emerging, you have to speak up. This is what I want you to take away from my speeches to you, because it was only the evil that happened because the world was indifferent. They saw everything. They heard everything. And yet, from the Pope on to every single individual that so decided, they assumed a posture of silence, of deafening silence. And this gave Hitler the green light to go ahead and do what he did, because he knows, he saw that the world was indifferent. So in every age, in our own time, we cannot afford to be indifferent to emerging evil signs of people that are trying to dominate us in an evil way. We cannot afford it. Because don't ever think that just because a certain group is being attacked and you are not at this moment, that you are immune. You are not. You are not immune. You will be next target. This is what happened. The very famous German priest, Lutheran priest, Martin Niemöller, was thrown in a concentration camp. He was a real German. He was a real Aryan, but he disagreed with some of Hitler's policies early on. He was thrown in the concentration camp together with all the other Jews and everybody else. And when he survived, he wrote a book and he stated some unbelievable, powerful admonitions. He says, when they came for the labor unionists, I didn't say anything because I was not a labor unionist. When they came for the communists, I did not say anything because I was not a communist. When they came for the disabled and the gays, I didn't say anything because I was none of those. And when they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything. I was not a Jew. But then they came for me, and there was no one to stand up and speak for me. That is exactly the words that were valid then, and they are valid now, and they'll be valid 1,000 years from now, because history will repeat itself if you let it. That's my message.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, not just today, but all the times that you share this story on a regular basis. And again, as mentioned, David, you speak so often to students. And so we thank you so much. We're so grateful for the fact that our future generations are learning this story and this message from you. So we thank you so much for speaking with us today, and thank you to our audience for tuning in. We hope to welcome you next Thursday for our weekly Survivor Talk. And thank you, of course, everyone for continuing to foster this history by listening to these talks. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you very much for everyone listening. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And
Have a nice day, all of you.